All right, everybody, thank you. Welcome. Appreciate you coming to today's event, sponsored by the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice. It's a hybrid event today, so we have some folks zooming in online. They will be able to ask questions after the presentations are done, interact with the panelists. You're also invited to interact with the panelists as well during the Q&A session. My name is Adam Muller. I'm the former director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program, still a Peace and Conflict Studies professor, and former acting director of the Morrow Institute. It was very exciting to hear about the publication of the book that's the center of today's discussion, Manufacturing Ignorance, Justice in the Age of Agnosis. I was telling Richard earlier, I couldn't imagine a more timely or topical kind of subject, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity that today's event presents to take up some very important questions about the nature of law and justice in the post-truth era. And I'm very curious to hear what the various panelists have to say. Before we get going, I'm going to go sit at my desk because I need my laptop. I'd like to begin with the territorial acknowledgement, which is an acknowledgement of land acknowledgement that we provide at the beginning of events like this to make clear where exactly we're located and what our responsibilities are in this territory. So the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Innuwak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Oyate, and Dennie, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to the two editors of this book, Dr. Richard Jochelson, Dean of Law, and Dr. James Gacek, who is an associate professor of justice studies at the University of Regina. Welcome, and please go ahead and take over.
Sounds great. Thank you, Adam, and thanks everyone who attended in person. For those online, you should know the room is just overflowing with people and standing room only, but we really appreciate you making the effort to get here. And I know the bandwidth is being significantly tested by, oh, they can actually see the amount of participants. All right. Even better. No, so seriously, we welcome you here today and to discuss Justice in the Age of Agnosis. This is the book. I guess this is something of an unofficial launch for us. We're not really holding a formal book launch where we're peddling books, but if you are interested in having a book peddled to you, if you just type this in Google, it'll come up. I think there's a QR code that you can go to on the event poster that can take you there too. One of the cool things about this publisher is you can also just buy individual chapters, so you don't have to, if you have a university license through the libraries, you can actually just get access to those chapters. So you don't have to get the whole thing. You don't even have to buy it if you got library access. But today our plan is roughly to, for James and I, to give you a rough overview of what drove us to write the book, some maybe basic concepts about this concept, this idea of agnosis, and then to really delve in with some of our most fun collaborators and contributors to sort of get into the sense of how agnosis is related to their work and their chapters. We only have about 2 or 3 such questions planned, and then we're hoping we can open it up to a broad discussion with questions and answers from you. So we've got a bit of a script James and I are trying to follow, and I probably, just by doing that introduction, I've probably eaten into 2 minutes of it, but that's okay. I will say, before I even knew I was interested in this topic, I was telling Adam, I started at the law school not as dean, I was an associate professor in 2016, and I remember reflecting at the time what a strange way of being it was, because you might recall that was right around a strike that happened at the university with UMFA, the Teaching and Researching Bargaining Unit. It was a time of provincial austerity where the problems for solving the financial issues we were facing seemed to be cutting the public sector and eroding social services, even in the face of advice from some of the most conservative economists that said that was the wrong approach to economic recovery. I don't know if anyone recalls that. And subsequently, there was a strike, and those issues weren't resolved until many years later through labor action. I don't want to relitigate that, but it struck me at the time how we had a provincial government ignoring leading economic conservatives, and they were a conservative government themselves. And I thought to myself, what is going on here? You're not listening to the empiricism of your own people. And of course, the left was using the same economic arguments to argue against deep cuts and erosion of the public service. I blinked in that job for a couple of months, came out of strike, and suddenly a game show host billionaire was the president of the United States. And his platform seemed to be based on that trip down the golden escalators at Trump Tower, where his pitch was immigrants are coming into the country and they're all murderers and rapists. I don't know if you remember that. And no one challenged it with empirical data, or if they did, it wasn't listened to. And next thing you know, 2020 election denialism, COVID, vax denialism of what governments could or ought to do in some cases, denial on left and right, not knowing on left and right, not using empiricism on left and right. And so when we thought of this topic, James actually approached me and said, hey, well, do you want to write a book on agnosis? And I said, I don't know. And he said, exactly. And that hooked me right away, because the concept of not knowing is linked to fundamental values in scientific inquiry, Western inquiry, Indigenous ways of knowing, and that is the question of testing ideas, right? Reflecting on ideas, telling stories about ideas, and seeing how they apply in light of the empiricism around us and a sense of empathy for other humans. And it seemed an apt time to look into it. So the book sort of starts off with a rhetorical question. It says, is ignorance bliss or is it pernicious, right? And that's an unfair binary, right? Really, sometimes it might be bliss for some people, but it is pernicious in the sense that it's everywhere, and it's promulgated in much more complex ways than it used to be. So obviously, agnosis means without knowledge, not having knowledge, and we all hear the phrase "knowledge is power," right? We struggle with that phrase, and in some ways, I think this book tries to show that knowledge is power, but also promulgating not knowing can be very powerful, also. And so early in the book, we talk about Martin and Smithson's conceptions. I don't get too theoretical, but conceptions of categories of not knowing. And so they talk about false knowledge, where actually they talk about absence of knowledge first, where facts are unknown. And I guess that would sort of be the toddler state. If I take a step on the stair, what happens next? Do I fall, or does it magically rise and I can keep walking forward? It's just not knowing, and that's in some ways a natural state for growing humans, right? And for our societies, I think we have this concept that we started in a state of not knowing and somehow evolved into knowing more. And we see the scientific method and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment as these forward and knowing, but that kind of steps towards knowing also breeds other types of false knowledge. So moments of false knowledge where incorrect information is accepted as truth. There can also be an absence of understanding where information exists, but we lack the ability to make sense of it. And then the scholars say there's false understanding where facts and falsehoods are mixed up and we interpret them incorrectly. And I think James and I don't see those as watertight in any ways. James describes it as a spectrum. I think it might be actually more complicated than that, because when I reflect on it, I think it also matters who's driving that agnosis, right? In a natural state, you're trying to learn. It's you contending with your environment, trying to gain knowledge. But there's so many other nodes of knowledge production. We're working on one of them. Academia. What happens if academia starts to absorb these norms of not relying on empiricism and empathy, and we just move into viewpoint worship, right? And we sell that. We teach that as knowledge, and we create a culture of that, and we breed that in our students. And how does that play out? And how does that play out when they are getting their information not from someone being a scribe and writing a copy scroll of the first document they ever saw, not from a printing press, but from a multinodal rhizomal system of interconnectedness that propagates disinformation within nanoseconds, like social media, right? And when we as academics get on social media, and in, I don't know how many characters, 280 characters, is that what it is now on X? In 280 characters, we try to promulgate our knowledge, and because we're experts, we can create a Twitter war. Yesterday there was an arbitration in the news coming out of University of Calgary involving a Twitter war between two academics, one of whom was disciplined for their conduct in this Twitter war. So as academics, or as citizens of the Academy, as students, as staff here, what responsibilities do we have when we stake out positions without empiricism and empathy? And of course, how is not embedded in culture, right? I think that's a really interesting question. We've used culture historically, obviously, in multifaceted ways, in terms of expression and not knowing and winning arguments. You see churches in Europe with pictures of erotica baked into the architecture as a form of resistance against state, church, or monarchical power. So this battle for expression and truth exists even in the architecture, pre-modern architecture, right? And we always just assume it's a marketplace of ideas, right? That's our undergirding concept, is that more speech will get us to better ideas and truth. But there's never been so many nodes to manipulate truth as we're currently facing in political, economic, and cultural systems. James will talk about some of these in just a second, and I'll hand it over to him for 7 minutes now, 8 minutes, something like that. But sometimes you can think of agnosis just in terms of our daily lives. As you're walking securely through campus, or you're enjoying part of the exchange district, there's a whole hidden world where people are overrepresented in carceral settings, way out of proportion to their population representativeness, Indigenous persons in particular. But there's a feeling that if you're feeling safe, maybe you don't have to look, you don't have to ask the clarifying questions. And the last point is really governments lean into that, right? Governments know how to push those buttons, and now they have more sources than ever to push not knowing in a way that meets their agenda. And scarier still, foreign agents or disruptors or resistance movements like Antifa, for example, might also use social media to promulgate emotive responses that are neither empathetic nor empirical. So that's the world we sort of found ourselves in, and I think in the context of elections that have happened and are ongoing, we may find ourselves in a major agnostic moment or agnosis moments coming up with the U.S. elections, perhaps with Canadian elections. I guess we'll know next week what's happening there. Post-COVID, seeing what's happened to public sector, the ignorance of kind of fundamental economic imperatives and knowledge foundations in having economic policy, or even in shutting down international students from coming to be educated in Canada because we somehow believe the PhD in astrophysics from the African continent is a threat to housing, right? These are all discussions that I think motivated us to ask the question, how does not knowing play into a variety of different disciplines? And so maybe I'll hand it over to James.
You covered so much, and I'm so happy for that because there were things in there that I've already have in my script that I don't need to cover, which is fantastic. Anyway, I very much appreciate Richard's insight, so thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm James Gacek. It's a pleasure to be here to see all you wonderful people. I'm from the University of Regina. I know Manitoba, Saskatchewan, there's a rivalry. I know where I'm from. Manitoba's better. We'll just start off right there. I get that. I understand that. I know where we're from. Now that we've covered a better sense of agnosis, and I really want to thank all the contributors who've contributed to our book. It's phenomenal. It's a labor of love for Richard and I, in part because of the journey it took to get publishers on board, but also the conversations in terms of agnosis and agnotology, right? So the study of knowledge or non-knowledge. And it was something that we felt even during the pandemic. I mean, one could argue the pandemic is still ongoing, so I don't want to close off that conversation. But during the height of the pandemic, there were certainly media reports and protest movements suggesting that all this denialism was happening and all this anti-vax movement was spiraling, and won't someone just think about all the scientific knowledge happening in the world, and us to do our own research, right? To trust ourselves versus big pharma and big government and so on and so forth. Which sparked those conversations with Richard and I, because we felt that there was a necessity to question what we knew, how we come to know aspects of the world around us, and how that can be weaponized and harmed by and through different marginalized groups. And so we felt that there were very much real world consequences that we had to understand, not only within our research, because I'm coming at this from a criminological background, I'm a criminologist by trade, but also from the legal profession, as my colleagues on the panel would attest, right? There are ways in which we can understand justice in a more broadly conceived manner. And it felt for us to have that type of conversation with Agnosis. And so it's not just an academic concept, it has serious real world consequences. For example, we can think of the criminal justice system, right? Some citizens may believe that because they feel safe, the system is working, but in other ways and at different moments in time, it ignores the over-incarceration of Indigenous and marginalized people. And I'm also a prisons researcher too. So I study prisons, I study jails, it's my body of work, so think of all the wonderful warm analogies of how much I love passion about my work, but I do study a lot in terms of corrections. And so we recognize consistently an over-incarceration of Indigenous and marginalized people, many of whom face vulnerable, intersecting realities and limited rehabilitative outcomes and opportunities. And this selective ignorance allows systemic oppression to continue unchecked in various different ways, right? And we explore some of those ways in this book here. For instance, during the Stanley trial, which some of you may be familiar with, others, it's certainly a very historical Saskatchewan case, right? The public focused on the narrative of justice for one group, ignoring the long history of injustice faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. One could also think of the movements like Black Lives Matter, right? We see similar calls for retributive justice in response to systemic oppression, but little focused on the or on rehabilitative solutions, right? So there's this push and pull between knowledge and how we come to terms with the weaponization of knowledge. Agnosis in these cases is not just about what people don't know. It's what they choose to not know about. And that is something that we also felt was very significant too, right? How is certain knowledge weaponized to harm groups either directly or indirectly, right? Are we talking about climate change denial? Are we talking about historical pollution that impacts certain groups over others in terms of where they may be living or wanting to live, right? So environmental racism is a conversation we need to have too. This kind of ignorance allows harm to continue while offering those in power the means to escape accountability, right? And we not only talk about the accountability within governments, but it's also politicians, it's also authority makers, it's also those who have a vying power in the market to determine that capitalism dominates overall, right? So there are market forces at play here that want to continue to harm certain groups continuously. And so how do we talk widespread phenomenon, right? So Richard's already addressed this in terms of organized labor in the public sector, and it's slowly been eroding in certain ways. Certainly from the Saskatchewan perspective, it is eroding because of the longstanding, I won't get into my distaste for the Mo government, as you may have already guessed, but the erosion of organized labor is concerning, right? And as labor rights erode, public apathy grows. People seem disconnected from the very systems they are supposed to support them. Another example is the rise of the anti-vax movement during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I've already discussed. Despite overwhelming evidence supporting the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, a significant portion of the population chose to ignore this information, leading to what would argue, or what can be argued as preventable illness and death, right? What's troubling here is that ignorance is often marketed as a form of empowerment. People are encouraged, like I was talking about before, to do their own research, right? And which calls into question the credentials of experts who have a better, one could argue, better sense of the research method, of the scientific method, right? To have a better sense of empiricism, right? To believe that they know better than experts. In this way, ignorance isn't just a lack of knowledge. One would argue it's a rejection of knowledge, right? It's the rejection of certain pieces of information that can actually be more helpful to bettering lives for many different groups. This is a key feature of what we argue is the age of agnosis that we're living in. We're constantly bombarded with disinformation and misinformation, and how do the common person, how do they sort that out, right? And these are ongoing conversations. We see that in different arenas, as our panelists will argue, right? But how do we understand this lack of knowledge or non-knowledge about the suffering of others? It's not just that people don't know the facts, but that they choose not to engage with them, right? Then in some cases, ignorance is blissful, right? And our question really is that bliss enough, right? Is that actually helpful for the state of the world that we're in right now? And so you might be then wondering, after all of this conversation, why the heck would we want to write a book all about it? And so Richard has graciously given us some insight into that, and I want to just complement that by saying, right now, more than ever before, we need to understand how ignorance operates, right? This book seeks to unpack the ways in which ignorance is produced, maintained, weaponized, and is used to be harmful for others. In a world where information is more accessible than ever, it seems rather paradoxical that ignorance is also on the rise, right? We have a swarm of information at our fingertips, yet people may choose to not engage with this information. So as misinformation spreads and facts are dismissed, agnosis becomes then a tool of power. Whether it's in the context, as I've discussed before, climate change denial, racial injustice, political corruption, the list goes on, ignorance is often used to protect the interests of the powerful. So our goal then, in the book and through our wonderful colleagues on the panel, is to provide readers with the analytical tools to recognize and hopefully resist agnosis, right? Find ways to understand the world about them in different ways, things that we might even have a better sense of when we turn on the TV or turn on our social media, right? Where we're watching the news or watching sports or reading about how AI is changing the world in very scary ways, right? It's about understanding how ignorance operates at both the individual and societal levels, and how we can combat it to create a more just and informed society. So I'd argue, and that many of us on this panel would argue, that we're at a critical juncture right now. As we confront global challenges, right, our ability to resist ignorance will determine our collective future. What do we want to see going forward? If we know that there's information that's being, if we know that there's misinformation that's being spread, if we know that information is being used to weaponize and harm certain groups, what does our collective future look like? And so our ability to resist ignorance is ever more important to understand right now. Agnosis thrives in silence, apathy, and distraction. But we do believe, and we still believe, this isn't a counsel of despair, we believe that we have the ability to push back, to value empirical truth, and to hold those in power accountable. And so essentially this book is a call to action, right? It's not just about identifying ignorance, but also about actively fighting against it. Essentially, we are living in an age where fabrication and falsehoods are rampant. And we must do everything in our power to uphold truth, knowledge, and empathy for those who are most affected by ignorance. And so that's my little spiel on the book, and I hope it was enjoyable for all of you. And I'm looking forward to those conversations, especially because Richard and I will be facilitating conversations with our wonderful panelists in a moment. Oh, I guess I should actually introduce the chapters. I'm not reading the script as I'm so engrossed in what we're saying and what we're already talking about. I should probably introduce the wonderful panelists. So we have on the panel Katie Szilagyi, Brandon Trask, and Martine, Dennie, thank you. And they've all provided wonderful chapter contributions, and rather than butcher their chapter summaries, I was hoping maybe they can speak for a minute or so about their chapters, because I feel that they would do more justice in that than I ever could. So Katie, please go ahead.
Sure, so my chapter is about artificial intelligence and machine learning in law, and about how using past information to train models that represent data in society can entrench sort of undesirable worldviews that can lead to problems down the line. And I mean, since we concluded work on this book over 2 years ago, right, things have really accelerated in this space with the advent of generative AI. Most people know it as ChatGPT, so it continues to be a really rich and fertile area for exploration of these kinds of issues.
Wonderful, thank you, Kate. Brandon.
Awesome. Yeah, so I actually sort of double dipped. I have kind of 1.5 chapters, but I had a co-author with me on the second chapter. So I will not talk about that chapter. because my co-author's not able to be here. So I'll focus on the one that I wrote solo, and that's basically looking critically at the judicial upholding to date of a number of different pandemic measures. I feel like I really need to say I am totally pro-vaccine. I feel like I really need to say that before I start. Certainly not an anti-vaxxer, certainly not an anti-masker, but I was a bit concerned with some of the evidentiary aspects of the decisions that we saw in court. For instance, where courts were allowing the experts who essentially made the calls to implement certain public health measures, allowing those individuals actually with their hands on making those decisions to testify as expert witnesses, and that really goes against a lot of what we have in our judicial system as far as checks on being who is a properly qualified expert. You shouldn't have somebody qualified as an expert if they themselves are defending the decision that they made. Like, there should be some independence there. So that really got me thinking about were courts motivated essentially looking at perhaps the big picture without following the principles that are set out, and was this in fact sort of results-based judging as opposed to going through the proper steps. So that's what my solo chapter is about.
Thank you, Brent. And Martine.
Thanks, James. So my chapter is centered around ignorance as it's socially constructed in the professional world of ice hockey. So I'm looking at ignorance as it's not a passive process, but it's an active construct that's produced by a dominant group. It's specifically intended to minimize or deny responsibility for causing harm to subordinate group. So I framed this around the concussion lawsuit against the National Hockey League, where the NHL claimed that there's not enough scientific research to establish a cause and effect relationship between hockey and concussions. And because of these scientific uncertainties, the NHL could deny causation and instill enough doubt to kind of keep the status quo and keep profiting off of the violent sport. While the NHL denies this link, the players are in fact living the correlation. So in the chapter, I draw on some in-depth interviews that I conducted with elite hockey players to examine more closely their lived experiences with injuries and how ignorance is produced in professional hockey.
Wonderful. Thanks, Martine. Thanks, panels. This is fantastic. I'm so looking forward to our conversation. Richard.
So we prepared a series of questions which you can veer off of as much as you like. And there's only 2 or 3 of them, and we think it'll still allow for some good audience participation. So the first question, it's a long one. The first question asks you to, in light of your chapters, discuss situations where individuals, whether consciously or unconsciously, accept a form of ignorance. How do you understand the roles of consent and agency in maintaining ignorance? And is ignorance willfully embraced by those involved, or is it imposed by an external structure? Loaded questions.
Katie, would you like to go first?
Always.
Okay, great. Please
All right.
proceed.
Well, I mean, there's so many different ways we can think about this through the lens of AI, right? Because on one side of the coin, you have a huge sort of like technological machination that is working in the background and then asking people to participate, right? By doing like little things like click, I agree, right? I consent. My favorite lately is that when websites ask you whether or not you want to agree to use cookies, it says, I agree, or maybe later, right? It doesn't even really present you with the opportunity to say no, which can really muddy the waters in terms of what do we understand to be consent in a technological context. And consent has such an important meaning in the legal space that when you start to water that down in terms of daily interactions that people are having with technological systems, it can have serious ramifications for, how you understand yourself and your own power vis-a-vis these systems. But the thing that I'm interested in, I think academically right now, around the use of AI systems is the degree to which people actually defer, so the second part of your question, agency, right? How people defer their own decision-making capability or capacity to these types of systems. So I like to talk about this through the lens of something that's called automation bias or automation complacency that comes to us from human automation interaction literatures, right? So like computer science literatures, ergonomics literatures, people who are kind of working on the human-computer interaction questions. And what we see replicated in those experiments is a very strong phenomenon where people will defer to the decision-making capabilities of the automated system, right? Because you believe that the automated system is just better at it than you are. You're a humble person, people are fallible, people make mistakes. This is a machine, right? Machines are good at stuff. So let's let the machine do it. And the problem is that the machine is not always good at stuff, but people check out, right? And so that creates this automation bias where you believe that, you can let the machine handle it. And it creates an over-reliance, which can also result in a kind of complacency, right? And in this complacency framework, people, they don't double check so much, even though they're supposed to, right? When we talk about using an AI mechanism to help us do things, we're often talking about maintaining a human in the loop, right? That's the language that people use. But what ends up happening is that human in the loop is just letting the machine drive because they've been induced into that psychological state that is well documented. So when we have legal approaches to having regulations in the AI space, they tend to not take into account that kind of interdisciplinary thinking, which ends up being a problem for like over-reliance on these types of tools. So one thing that I'm particularly worried about is this idea that people are going to use ChatGPT, for example, to create their first drafts. And no big deal, right? It's just going to be a first draft, and then you're going to come back in and you're going to prune it and you're going to make it better and you're going to expand upon it in the same way that you would if you had, you were a lawyer and you had a junior working for you, or you were a professor and you had a research assistant working for you, right? It's just a first draft. But the degree to which we over-rely on the technological of these types of systems is considerable, right? So to what degree is the output that is generated by an AI system going to be what carries the day, right? And then there's a whole lot of things that we could go into that would problematize the content that those types of systems are capable of producing.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, thanks. So I think what got me interested in this area was essentially this whole discussion. Okay, so the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right, it applies to government and sort of the public sector. I started thinking before the vaccines were even available in the pandemic, and again, very pro-vaccine. I feel like I need to say that more on the but yeah, I was very pro-vaccine, but I started to think like, what might be an interesting political play by government as the vaccines start to get rolled out? And I kind of anticipated that what turned out to be the, sort of termed the vaccine passports. I sort of had a feeling that we were going in that direction. I was interested in studying, whether this might be an issue as far as charter rights, as far as provincial human rights codes. So that got me interested in that aspect of COVID, or the COVID response to the pandemic. And so again, charter applies to the public sector, provincial human rights codes apply to the private sector as well as the public sector. But when we started to see governments first kind of think out loud about the potential for vaccine passports, then they made it clear, like, oh, well, actually, we would just create the documentation, but hey, the charter wouldn't apply because we're going to offload, the responsibility for checking these documents to like the 16-year-old, working at the restaurant, dealing with people as they first come in the door. The government's going to offload to that person making, $15 an hour, the responsibility to essentially screen for that little QR code in Manitoba and in other jurisdictions. And I thought, well, that's interesting. The government's kind of trying to do through the back door what they probably wouldn't be permitted to do, directly. They're essentially trying to offload to the private sector these responsibilities. And so that came at a really interesting time. I wrote some op-eds, Globe and Mail, and in the Toronto Star. There was like a debate feature in the Toronto Star, and Dr. Colleen Flood, who's a brilliant expert in sort of health law in Canada, wrote the opposite side of the debate from me, saying, well, essentially there are, this is a situation where we should be allowed to use vaccine passports. And anyway, I remember, not that I care about popular support, but I was curious just to see what the measure was on the poll on the Toronto Star website. And at that point, before governments were seriously moving in this direction, more people were, at least in this totally unscientific Toronto Star poll, more people clicked the no, we should not have vaccine passports. And that was right around the time Trudeau was saying, no, I don't want to get into vaccine passports. Of course, fast forward a few months later, and that became a focal point, a wedge issue in the election. And so anyway, I really got to thinking about this whole area and this debate about, well, what happens when sort of individual rights come into conflict with public health, big picture ideas, and of course, rights are not absolute. I think that's super important, right? They're subject to reasonable limits. But the point is, those reasonable limits have to be justified by government, and that's a really essential part of Section 1 of our charter, the main sort of rights limiting aspect. And anyway, like I said, I delved into a number of different court decisions for subsequent challenges to a number of different responses to COVID. And I just felt that the Section 1 analysis was often not done really well. And actually, I traced a lot back to Canadian courts relying on the US Supreme Court's decision in one case that really should have had no applicability to Canada, because the test in the US is very different than the Canadian test. And I just thought that, we're ignoring at least the proper process to go through. Like, even if you get to that result, and there are ways you can get there, we can't ignore that Canada has its own laws that are pretty clearly set out here. And so that's what I found really, really interesting.
Thanks, Brad. Martine?
Hey, thanks. So the question of consent and agency is super interesting to me, because professional hockey players in theory have agency. It's hard to imagine a professional hockey player making millions of dollars to play a game. It's hard to imagine them as an exploited worker. But when we kind of start to peel back the layers, we start to uncover that there is a lot of exploitation. So in the National Hockey League, the business interests, the power balances, they're all defined by a sporting culture that prioritizes winning over player safety. So players are not ignorant of the fact that hockey is a physical sport. They may be injured. Every single hockey player I talk to can give me a huge list of injuries they experienced. So they're not denying that injuries can occur. But what I've uncovered is that hockey leagues work really hard to legitimize violence. They promote it. As part of the lawsuit, one of the claims of players was that the NHL promotes and glorifies violence. They want to keep it in the game, so they're not interested in safety in that sense. But more broadly, the culture of hockey, it's shaped by socialization into what is known as the code. So it's a series of unwritten rules around violence and retaliation. It's shaped by masculinity, the normalization of pain and injury. There's an occupational pressure to play through pain and injuries, which just leads to more serious and longer term injuries. And this win at all costs mentality. So all of these elements kind of shape a player's consent. And what ends up happening is these players are kind of existing in a space where they can't communicate no. So it's consent or quit hockey. Sacrifice your body or go play something else. And in a lot of my interviews, players talked about things like if you express concern over your body, your safety, if you're not willing to sacrifice your body, then you're labeled weak or you're soft, you're not a team player, and you just get marginalized, you might lose ice time, you might get cut from the team eventually. So there's a lot of retaliation and punishment involved in expressing anything that goes against the culture. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Had me on bated breath. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Martine. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that's a great insight into some of the chapter summaries just some of the chapters that are included in this book. Again, not shamelessly self-promoting, but you can feel free to pick up a copy. You can buy individual chapters, even hours you could buy if you wish. You might not want to, but you can if you want to. And so my question then, going from just some of the conversations we've had with the previous question to something more focused on power structured and manufactured ignorance. So we asked panelists to consider, for example, that agnosis often involves power relations that either enforce or encourage ignorance. And we've seen aspects of that already in the conversation. In your view, my wonderful panelists, what role do power structures, whether social, legal, institutional, or something in between, what role do power structures play in maintaining ignorance in the context you've studied? In other words, who benefits from keeping individuals or society in the dark? Katie?
Well, when we bring technological systems into the legal space in particular, so there's lots of ways in which automated decision-making mechanisms have displaced particularly administrative tribunals and administrative processes already within the Canadian state and very broadly internationally. So we can call these like automated decision makers, ADMs, these sorts of systems. And what happens, there's a few things that happen, but one thing that's really sort of nefarious is it takes, a carefully delegated legislative responsibility of saying, all right, who is in charge? What kind of power is there? And what kind of constraints exist on that power? So you can even think about it in the context of police, right? Police use now all kinds of technological tools. Theoretically, police would have a police oversight board, right? Police are subject to all kinds of legislation, and police would also be subject to the various charter rights and responsibilities that would exist in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But when you start introducing new kinds of technologies into the mix, there's a new problem where the makers of those technologies also now have power within a publicly oriented system, right? So now you have this sort of mixing of public and private, of people who are motivated by profit, who have shareholders to report to, who are, working hard in Silicon Valley to come up with the next big tech and are operationalizing their product, right? We saw this with Clearview AI a couple of years ago, when this product suddenly swept all of the police forces in North America. People were really excited about the identification prospects of having facial recognition technology at work, and very quickly thereafter, people were like, wait, who built this data set? Where did it come from? This data has been scraped from the internet. People are doing various sort of nefarious web crawling mechanisms in order to obtain these photos. There's privacy implications, there's charter implications, there's lots of problems. And so you sort of have this public-private nexus that gets created when you have an unthinking adoption of private sector tools into public-facing bodies or legislative aspects, right? And so you can cure that problem, right? We can make a distinction between insider and outsider tools, right? Where you would have government agencies that would commission a purpose-built tool to be specifically made for its purposes, and maybe you store that data in-house and you have transparency into how the different algorithmic processes are performed. But by and large, what happens instead is that external or outsider tools are imported into these different settings, right? So then you're bringing with it that all of the concerns of capitalism, but you also have this opacity problem where you don't necessarily know how the decisions are being made, how we get from A to B in terms of the various machinations that are going on with the background of the data. And that's important in administrative decision-making contexts or other legal contexts where you want to know exactly how decisions are made, right? We have really important legal paradigms that are about due process, are about reasonable access to information, are about the ability of a decision maker to give reasons, particularly in an administrative law context, which is the place where most members of the public are going to be interacting with a legal body in their life, right? So if you now no longer have access to the reasons for the decision, there are problems that kind of crop up in terms of understanding how power is being wielded and what kind of controls we can place on that power.
Thank you, Katie. Brandon.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, as far as power structures and you know who may benefit essentially from the agnosis that I identified in my chapter, I mean, thinking about it, sort of the political realm and the legal realm, and frankly, it's really hard to divorce the two. Law is inherently political, even though we sometimes like to think that you know it's apolitical. Well, it's inherently political. So you know, I think we've seen unprecedented levels of political polarization, I would say, in recent years. We're still living that, sadly. You know, I think the pandemic and the response to the pandemic really helped to drive that. And again, you know, the vaccine stuff became, and again, I'm very pro-vaccine. There we go. But I think just seeing that as a wedge issue, right, and the responses to the pandemic as a wedge issue in 2021 really drove this division. And I think, you know, ultimately that ended up favoring governments largely that were in power, at least, you know, at the early stages of the pandemic. And so I'm not pointing fingers at any one political party, by the way. You see those you know, very classy F Trudeau flags all over the place. Well, actually, most of these measures were brought in by provincial governments, right? A lot of them actually conservative leaning provincial governments. So yeah, I am nonpartisan. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody in particular. I think those in power at the time did really benefit from the political polarization ensuing. And the courts, because that was my main area of interest here, the courts, by not, in my view, properly applying, in many cases, the law of evidence, not properly putting governments through their paces under the Section 1 justification for rights infringing measures, that, you know, in a way, benefited the courts as well as the government. And, you know, yes, we have independence of the courts. Absolutely we do. But there was a lot of cooperation between the courts and government. And so a lot of the cases I identified actually dealt with, you know, the issue of whether unvaccinated jurors or jurors who may have been vaccinated but weren't willing to sort of produce proof of vaccination, whether those prospective jurors could actually serve on juries. And, you know, most of the decisions I found said no, they were excluded from serving on a jury of peers. You know, I found that interesting and you know, problematic. I also found, you know, in a different paper that I wrote with a co-author, Manitoba, through the courts, was really applying pressure on individuals charged with murder to re-elect to have a judge-alone trial. For those of you following the news with the Jeremy Szilagyi case, you know, as we all know, I think after that, especially members of the public are aware, the default for a murder case is judge and jury. And an individual, Szilagyi, wanted a judge-alone trial. Well, initially the Crown wasn't agreeing to that, and to go to a judge-alone trial, you need the Crown's consent. So here we go in just a few years from a situation where you know, the Crown and the courts were really trying to get everybody moved over to a judge-alone trial, so they didn't have to worry about the logistics of judge and jury and the pandemic restrictions. You know, and essentially people were told, well, you can wait for a judge and jury trial, but that could take a really long time. Or if you want to have, timely justice, well, you got to go judge alone. And so anyway, I thought that was a really interesting consideration, because again, after the pandemic, or not after the pandemic, as James said, but after the height of it, I guess, now you've got individuals wanting a judge alone trial, and you're certainly not seeing the cooperation on that. So anyway, just really interesting things to think about.
Thank you, Brad. Very, very interesting. Thank you. Martine.
Yeah, so on the power structures, I think that's key when we're talking about professional sport. So professional leagues like the National Hockey League, they make the rules, they profit off of the athlete's skills, they frame dangerous workplace hazards as simply part of the game, no big deal, it's just part of the game. So the relationship between the players and the league and their teams is marked by this power imbalance, where the NHL has all the power and the players just have to put up with the working conditions. And I want to give a few examples from my interviews because I think they really illustrate what I'm talking about. So some of my participants talked about, for example, if a coach directed them to play with physicality or violence and they chose not to, they saw their ice time reduced or they were benched for the rest of the game. In contrast, there's another player who he would split ice time with another defenseman, so he would play one game, the other defenseman would play one, and they'd swap out. The coach directed him to go fight one of his opponents. He didn't want to because he's not much of a fighter, but he decided, I'll do it anyway. After he fought, he was rewarded with more ice time, so he started playing 2 games, and the other defenseman would play 1, he'd play 2, and so on. So we're seeing these kind of punishments for not playing physically or violently, and then we're seeing players rewarded for playing with violence. And so we've got these kind of powerful people like coaches directing players to play with more violence, and more violence means more likely more injuries, possibly more severe injuries. But then add another layer to this is that players also learn through the socialization process in hockey culture that the thing to do, the honorable thing to do, is to play through pain and injury. So even when you do suffer an injury, you're expected to, if you can, right? Obviously, if you have a broken leg and you physically can't skate, that's different. But if you can still play, you still play. And again, some examples from my research. This is from women's hockey. A hockey player, she made a mistake on the ice, and her coach punished her for making a mistake. So again, it's this win at all costs mentality, punished for making a mistake. And she wanted to regain the trust of her coach, and so she went after an opponent and physically used some physicality, and in the process, she broke her wrist. She didn't want to tell her coach that she broke her wrist because she didn't want to be punished further, so she finished the game with a broken wrist. The coach noticed she wasn't playing like her usual self, so she had to disclose the injury. When the coach found out about the injury, he punished her even more by forcing her to play the rest of that game and do some extra workouts after the game. So we've got just these really powerful people that are just kind of controlling this. So even when we have an athlete that's trying to take care of their bodies post-injury, they're being punished for being injured, or there's different layers. And of course this is different. Some players talked about these kind of individual team cultures that some teams have great coaches and it was a very positive experience. So this is not every single team. But there were more negative experiences than these positive ones. And so we're seeing these power imbalances at different levels, and whether it's from coaches, trainers, or leagues. But another layer that I want to mention is also the idea of the NHL dream, right? Especially when we're talking about players at the Canadian Hockey League level. They're trying to make it to the National Hockey League. Their goal is to play professional hockey. And so they do whatever they're told because they're promised that this is a pathway to the NHL. So these players at the CHL level are at very, very high risk for that reason, because they think if they say no, they're not going to get drafted, their entire career is gone. And so there's a lot of exploitation kind of happening through those power structures. And so to your question on who benefits, professional hockey, which is very, is a $1 billion enterprise, benefits. The players, I would say, benefit to a certain extent, and I do have a quote in my chapter that is pretty striking. It does seem like they don't want to let the fear of brain damage get in the way of their professional hockey career, so there is a level of ignorance there on the part of the players where in some ways they'd rather not know the scientific research and the reality that a concussion is not just getting your bell rung, it is brain damage. And the quote that I have in the chapter where the participant was an NHL player at the time, and I asked him if he thinks about the risks of concussions, and he says every day, every time I'm on the ice. And he actually blames the NHL, where he says because they brought awareness to it. They brought awareness to it, so now we're thinking about it, now we're worried about it. And I asked him, is it still a risk you're willing to take? And he thought about it for a while, and he says, yeah, it has to be. If I want to stay in the league, it has to be, right? So there is kind of a level of willful ignorance to that extent, but it's shaped by the exploitation, right? It's the production of ignorance that the NHL wants them. They want them to be ignorant, because if they actually think about it, they might want to fight for change and better safety mechanisms in hockey. So the players might like living in ignorance, but it's not a benefit to them. They deserve to know all the risks and what they're really experiencing. And so at the end of the day, yeah, it's the NHL benefits.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. And so we thank you very much for the panels.
We have other questions prepared, but we noticed there's half an hour left, and so we think it might be a good time to open it up to questions from all of the people here. There's so many that there's hardly any seats left, and folks online. And to the extent, if there's not questions, we'll continue with our own. But there's probably great discussions to be had across these different areas. It's interesting to see studies of ignorance across corporate, public, and I guess other corporate and labor-related spheres, right? So you're seeing it in different modalities.
So actually, we have got about 15 minutes left for questions, just for but I don't think there's any hard stop there if the conversation's going well, but just formally speaking, if you need to go 12:45, that was the scheduled time, please feel free to do so. But this is a very opportune moment to sort of enlarge the discussion, bring people both in the room and online into the frame. What I'd ask, if you're online, please just raise your hand and I will just click a button so that you can ask your question. Please identify yourself, and if you have a professional or academic affiliation, please just say so, and that extends to the folks in the room too, when you ask your questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really interesting. Your book is really interesting. Aristotle Metaphysics was my favorite book in childhood, and it is very related to your observation. I have a couple of questions. First, it is how culture, how we can differentiate culture from governmental brainwashing. Because basically children, they started their education at schools, and how we can determine this, because different countries have different educational system, and how we can differentiate it. Second, how we can determine knowledge, because we don't know what is knowledge, and also you are like teaching law. Law is knowledge or it is information, and knowledge has transient or constant nature. Our constitutions, our legal systems were invented in 18th century during industrialization. We are living in post-industrial society now, long ago. but using that knowledge and that system of public administration. What do you think about this?
Those are softballs.
Yeah. Easy.
Does anyone on the panel want to take some of those? So I think there's a three-parter. How do we distinguish or differentiate culture from government brainwashing? How do we determine knowledge, for example, law, is it information or is it knowledge? And what do we have to say about the constancy or transience of knowledge? With a shot across the bow that we're rooted in some case in Canada in hundreds of years of common law, and I would add influenced highly culturally and legally by Victorian mores and society. But that same argument could be made in other jurisdictions for their earlier traditions as well. There's an historical shadow that's cast over law and policy tracing back in time. So anyone want to comment on differentiating between culture and government brainwashing? I mean, I can lead off the discussion. I think they're interwoven, right?
I can say, for example, North and South Korea, the same human beings, different governmental brainwashing and different economic result and different even democratic results.
Absolutely, and it's interwoven, right? And even in free societies, right, government brainwashing or disinformation is rampant, and I think it's much easier now
And
to influence public thought, even in democratic systems. I think the gulf between democracy and dictatorship is narrowing because of multimodal information systems.
that's why Plato and Socrates, they hated democracy for this brainwashing, because governments brainwash people and they call then it is democracy.
So I mean, I think they're interwoven, and I think, but culture also takes on modes of resistance, right? If you think of Iran, right, the culture of resistance in Iran is answering the culture of dictatorship from the Ayatollah, right? So it's not a bright line. I think there's a fusion. The danger we have right now is it used to take time for knowledge to travel, right? If you contrast the first iteration of whatever was, the first testament, someone had to, either you guarded it closely, tenement to tenement, right? You took it to your temple, and eventually a scribe, might copy it out, and there was errors in translation. You go to Victorian England, there was huge archaeological excavations that revealed, for example, in Pompeii, quite pornographic, what we would consider modern pornographic images. The idea of pornography develops, right, in Victorian society, and only gentlemen scholars were allowed to access that material. But then the printing press was, formed, and that spread. And the concept then was knowledge gets you to truth, but there's so many wild cards on knowledge proliferation now, right? There's no chance to digest the piece of knowledge that's coming your way anymore because it's infinite, right? And I think what's happening now that is fundamentally changing culture is you go into Twitter or X, Insta, whatever the kids are using nowadays. You get a statement. It's 2020 election was rigged. That's a good one, right? And you look at the likes, and it's 1 million people like that, right? There's no chance to digest, explore, ask questions. So tying into your last question, knowledge can't be constant. It has to be transient. But it's the question of asking clarifying questions and contesting the answers to those clarifying questions and engaging in that deep study that produces knowledge. But it's not an endpoint. I think it's knowledge development is a process. And to the extent we're watering down that process, diluting that process, and I think we are, right? I think social media helps in that process. When we take broad academic social justice stands in 280 characters without empirical data, without qualitative data or quantitative data or empathy, understanding where people are coming from, which I don't think you can do in 280 characters in any meaningful way. We actually interfere, I believe, with that process of knowledge production, or we've created a new form of knowledge production that our current idea of knowledge processing can't meet the challenge of. And so I think recognizing there's not one knowledge, right? recognizing the process of continual questioning, refinement, and trying to digest what expertise means is really important. And I think the absence of doing that, and actually I was heartened to see in the last American debate between, keep going back to America because it's the most infotainment based of the public examples, but you can contrast the last two presidential debates, right? If you actually sort of watch it on a content analysis basis. If you watch Harris versus Trump, it was the first time I can remember someone actually bringing up economists and empirical findings in challenging what Trump was saying. But if you go back to the Biden-Trump debate right before, it was, I'm the best, no, I'm best, you're a disgrace, right? So like raising the level of discourse to actually rely on evidence to challenge the other person is critical. I was saying to Adam before we started, what is the difference between the way we engage in social justice advocacy now versus, for example, the civil rights movement? I mean, there was elements of harshness in the civil rights movement. I'm not trying to say there wasn't, but there was an inherent empirical basis for it. You could quantify that people weren't being treated equally. And some of the people lobbying on that movement, in that movement, were able to stoke the empathies of people that hadn't considered that way of being. And that was a breakthrough, the combination of empathy and empiricism. I think now we just go with, you believe this, it's a spiritually correct position, and if you don't believe this, you're an awful person and you don't exist to us. And both ends of the political spectrum are doing that, right? So obviously transient, but it's the process of knowledge production that I think is important. I don't know if others have.
Adam has his hand up. Maybe in response to what you said.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I don't want to butt in, and if somebody else has a question, but like, I just think this is so interesting, but it reminds me of this essay by Harry Frankfurt, this influential essay by Frankfurt, right, called On Bullshit. And Frankfurt's philosopher, important philosopher, distinguishes between lying and bullshit. Lying is transgressing a line that you know to be there. Bullshit is not believing there's any line whatsoever. And I think this is a question for all of the panelists in light, partly of what Richard just said. In your specific cases, do you see agnosis as a species of lying or a cousin of lying, or do you see it as a species or cousin of bullshit? Like, what's the problem here? Is it the problem that there's mendacity and people just like want what they want and they're willing to get it by whatever means, or do they just not accept the difference between fact and fiction? Because I think you could actually maybe it's both, but in your specific cases, how did you approach the question of the nature of agnosis?
And it might be different in different contexts,
Sure.
even within the same example. But like the ChatGPT example, somebody did a great little essay earlier this year. ChatGPT is bullshit, which I loved, and they're picking up on the Frankfurt argument. And that, I think, crystallizes the problem with like hallucination or with confabulation, right? These ideas that a large language model is going to pop out information that is adjacent to being correct, but isn't really correct. Or maybe it's extremely shallow, or it takes these ideas or puts it together. Or in some situations, it's just going to completely come up with something completely crazy. And then if we are unthinkingly accepting this, if we do defer responsibility in a technological context to the automation, to the machine, right, then that's going to have serious implications for the process of knowledge production, right? And then when we start importing that kind of information into law, into legal mechanisms, that creates a host of new issues where you have law functioning as a systematizing force that is designed towards creating societal cohesion and creating something that people believe to be what the law is and believe to be what they are supposed to do, right? Law doesn't work if the people don't believe in it, right? Then we kind of fall away into this weird state of anarchy, or we don't have people following the laws for the reason that the laws have been set out. And so law loses its power as a legal fiction or a systematizing force if it gets watered down by that kind of bullshit. That's what I think.
Title for the sequel book.
Yeah, I mean, I would pick up on exactly what Katie was saying there. I mean, I think part of law, right, and this goes back to the initial question too, like you've got this tension, right, where law gives us a really good system. If people believe in it, as Katie said, but law gives us a structure and processes by which we arrive at an outcome. And so law values finality as well. Well, how do you reconcile law's desire for finality with, the fact that knowledge is transient, is ever developing, right? And just this comment, Justin Trudeau famously, trust the science. Well, what the hell does that mean, right? Trust the science. The science is ever developing. So how do we come up, and again, I don't mean to just pick on Justin Trudeau, use the Polyev, similar, another 3-word slogan, right? Axe the tax. Okay, well, let's think about that. Think about all the implications flowing from that, right? And the sort of ignorance that's built into that. Well, axe the tax. Okay, so does that mean taxes pay for things? So does that mean we get rid of social programs? Does that mean we don't care about the environment anymore? Like, all of these things are packaged together, right? And so, again, I think I hate social media. I'm not on social media at all. And I think, seeing that we've now gone the direction of having these quote unquote policy debates in how many characters? 280. Yeah. Like, that's ridiculous, right? Or even worse, these 3-word slogans driving us. So yeah, I think we need to be aware. Law creates a way for us to get at outcomes if we trust the principles baked into them. And if we start to shortcut those principles, we're really embracing the ignorance that is perpetuating throughout society, and it just becomes a shortcut to essentially an easy outcome at any given time. So I don't know, I'm maybe a little biased here, but I think we need our principles. We need to go back to basics and trust our principles and rely on them most in emergency situations, as opposed to like, oh, well, we'll just step away from those for a little bit. This is how we get the temporary income tax that was brought in to pay for World War I, right? It's only for this short period of time. And I'm not anti-tax either. Not anti-tax, not anti-vax. I'm just using these examples. So, thank you.
We have a question. You had your hand up earlier.
My question is, what are the generally acceptable, enduring moral principles that underline all of this analysis? The second thing, who do you trust? The third one, what is the verification tools that people can use in our academics to determine what is most likely, the most reliable knowledge?
So some more easy questions.
Yeah, it's a much easier question. Well, maybe starting with the first aspect. I think freedom of inquiry is critical, right? If we get to a point where we don't have that ability to question and contest ideas in the first place, which I think we're shying away from in the last 10 years, maybe more than we have, that shuts down, that just creates a bifurcation into polarities. So that was the first part. The second part of your question was
the need for generally acceptable, enduring moral principles that are generally accepted on a necessary universal basis, because we're no longer confined. Knowledge is all over the world. So.
But in terms of moral principles, I think there are some moral principles that have to forever be debated, right? But freedom of inquiry drives them all, right? And understanding arguments, challenging those arguments with evidence where possible, and answering each other's questions. That's the only thing I can see to sort of get us out of the spiral of disinformation. But that process itself, I think, is being devalued, right? So there might be other moral principles that individuals believe in, and I don't want to contest those or not. But like, for example, freedom of religion, right? We don't necessarily have to agree with everyone's religious beliefs, but we do believe everyone has the freedom to choose how they're going to worship or not worship, right? We're not talking about contesting those fundamentals, but you should be able to ask critical questions, right? About, is belief X in religion Y violative of our basic charter rights, right? We should be able to ask those questions without then being told, well, that's racist, and therefore you don't exist, right? As long as the question's coming from a place of clarifying and trying to understand, not trying to label some group as less worthy, right? So I think we have to get back into the ability to have that discourse. I think we have to get back into the ability to have that freedom of inquiry. but it has to be from a genuine and honest place, those kinds of questions. They have to be backed by some sense of empathy and respect. I think everyone on the panel agrees with. And they also have to have some empirical basis, right? Like you can ask loaded questions that I think stoke fires where there's no empathy or empirical basis. Like if I said, well, which parts of the protocols of the Elders of Zion do you agree with, Brandon? Right? That's not free inquiry. That's not open inquiry. I've set him up to essentially legitimate something that we should have a scientific conversation about, showing how it's completely, false. It's being disproven. It's been a source of propaganda, since, well, it's effectively adopted Napoleonic literature. So the question should be much more specific, scientifically based, and based on concepts of human respect. But we should still be able to have difficult questions. So our responsibility as academics is to make sure we're asking questions in that spirit. We can't demand that everyone ask questions similarly, but I think we have to raise our game in bringing empiricism and empathy into our question asking. And I think our panelists have done that, right, in their chapters, and I encourage you to read them. And they're doing them across vastly different areas and across, frankly, different political spectrums. And to give you a sense of ignorance in action, Brandon, I'm going to put you on the spot, Johnny on the spot, and to put it in Martine's hockey terms, I guess. Brandon's chapter was very difficult to get peer reviewed, right? Even though it's a very moderate chapter, and he's asking questions about fundamental bases of law and the moral conceptions of liberty and free speech and the ability to gather as a group, freedom of assembly. Reviewers just saw it and said, oh, this is someone that's challenging the COVID narrative. Like, you can't possibly, it would be irresponsible to publish this.
Which was ironic for the book.
Yes. Yeah. And we kept pushing hard against that. And eventually the reviewer relented when we sort of like phrased it in a way that they could understand that it was a series of questions, not a polemic. But they weren't even able to receive it as non-rhetorical, right? So we have to up our game as academics, even when we're being challenged on our ideas. Like what Brandon says, he agrees with the science of vaccination. That's pretty clear so far. He's been proven right, actually. The federal court said, you know what, it wasn't an the sort of trucker convoys weren't an emergency. It didn't rise to the level of legal emergency. But what can you do now? It's too late. But the point is, he was right to raise those concerns, and he wasn't doing it in the context of saying the science doesn't exist. Those spaces for those conversations have to take place, and academics that are raising that empiricism and that sense of empathy. In the response, you were asking, what about people that want to get together? What about people that knowingly face the risks that don't pose a danger to the public? What about those folks? Those are the folks affected by the passport. That's the methodology, I think, that academics have to aspire to use. And there's no one way to do that. But if you're just saying stuff is true because you're an expert, I'm a criminal justice expert, and therefore defund all police, full stop, and I don't explain why, I don't think I've engaged in appropriate knowledge inquiry. I think you can get to defund the police, by the way, like by Brandon. I'm not saying defund the police is a wrong or right movement. What I'm saying is academics have to walk us through with evidence and also a sense of perspective sharing, how they get to that point. And that's what the book's asking, I think, academics to do, and I think asking citizens and residents and people living on this land to do. And sometimes that knowledge is coming from oral tradition, but that's empirical too. It's important to realize empirical doesn't necessarily mean Western ways of knowing. It means empirical ways of knowing. That can be oral tradition, that can be hearing from witnesses, it could be talking to elders. But that inquiry and that process of inquiry and refining the questions and refining the answers and then challenging those answers, that's what we have to get back to as a society. And maybe we were never there in the first place, but we're certainly a greater distance away from it now, I think, than we'd be.
So I actually think that, with respect, it's a perfect place to end. We're actually over time for the scheduled time. Folks are going to stick around for a minute or two, I imagine, so there'll be more opportunities to follow up directly with people. Thank you for coming today. Thank you very much to Richard, to James for the administrative work required to put the panel together. I thought it was a fascinating, timely discussion. Thank you very much.